In this short course, we're going to take a look at the whole of the Old Testament. 39 books, 23,145 verses, 622,700 words in 2 hours. I feel a little bit like Woody Allen, who took a speed reading course and read the whole of Tolstoy's War and Peace in just 2 hours. His conclusion? It involves Russia. The church as a whole really struggles with the Old Testament and has adopted a number of different strategies for dealing with it. First strategy, ignore it completely. Second strategy, ignore it except for the Psalms because they can be helpful in helping people deal with their troublesome emotions. Third strategy, focus in on a few specific prophecies about Christ and a few details of the feasts that point to Jesus. Fourth strategy, try and take some faith lessons from a few of the famous stories, particularly David and Goliath, Noah and the Ark, Jonah and the whale, and particularly keep them for family services. The problem with all of these strategies is that they all ignore nearly all of the actual text of the Old Testament. And so over the next 6 sessions, we'll look at the big story of the Old Testament, at how the New Testament uses that Old Testament story in light of Jesus, and of what that means for us and for our life. In this session, we're going to do an introduction, and we're going to look at creation and fall, or how God made everything wonderful and how we messed it up. Then, over the next 5 weeks, we'll look at the story of Israel in 5 acts: the patriarchs, the Exodus, the kingdom, the exile, and the Messiah. In the next session, I'll introduce the story of Israel, but this week we're going to focus on creation and fall. We're going to think about God's wonderful, ruined world. Genesis chapters 1 to 11 set up the whole story of the Bible. The 2 creation accounts in Genesis chapters 1 to 2 give the reason for existence and the reason for our life. God wants a world, and God wants a people who reflect him into his creation and with whom he can share his love and his creativity. This is why the world is wonderful. The first creation account in Genesis chapter 1 focuses on God and our relationship with him. So the first 2 verses say this: in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. And God goes on to create the world in a week. And on the first 3 days, he brings order to the formless chaos. And on the second 3 days, he fills the emptiness. Then God goes on and he created Adam and Eve and commissioned them to rule and to be fruitful and multiply. In other words, to bring order to the chaos and to fill the emptiness. To join in with what God was doing in his creation project. We're called to share in God's work of creation. The second creation account in Genesis 2 focuses on the relationship between people and the relationship between humanity and the rest of the created world. This is God's wonderful world, and we're called to join in with what he's doing. That's the plan, but of course it all went wrong. The serpent slithered up and tempted Adam and Eve. Genesis 3 verses 4 and 5. You will surely die," the serpent said to the woman. "For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." And so the serpent persuaded Adam and Eve not to trust what God had said, but to try evil for themselves, to judge for themselves, and by judging good and evil for themselves, to become like God. Now God gave Adam and Eve the gift of freedom so they could rule and know something of his freedom. But they abused the gift of freedom that God had given them, and they used it to make choices that went against the love and the goodness of their Creator. Adam and Eve took matters into their own hands and tasted evil for themselves, taking evil into themselves and bringing slavery and death. And over the rest of Genesis chapters 3 to 11, we see sin and evil rippling out to families, to nations, to empires, to the whole world. And God's wonderful world was ruined. This is the story of God's creation and of our fall. And that story is the context for the whole of the rest of the Bible, the story of God's rescue plan for his ruined world. Now, in the middle of that story of the great unravelling, we read the story of the flood. Genesis 6, verse 5 and 6 say this: "The Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. The Lord was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain." God would bring judgment on the whole earth to wipe out sin and evil, but he was going to rescue a seed from the old world and plant it into the renewed world. The flood is a picture of God's final judgment. Noah is a picture of Abraham, who we're going to look at in the next session. The ark is a picture of Jesus, and we are Noah's family, those who are going to be brought safely through the final judgment and into God's renewed world. So that's God's wonderful ruined world. How does the New Testament draw on the story of creation? Let's consider the opening verses of John's Gospel. And they say this: "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning." The author of the Gospel is deliberately echoing the verses at the beginning of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the author is linking his account of Jesus' life to the creation story. And he's doing it for two reasons. Firstly, he wants to tell us who Jesus is. And secondly, he wants to tell us what Jesus is doing. Now, in Genesis, God created the world by speaking. And in John, the author calls Jesus the Word, and he says this about the Word: "Through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that has been made." In other words, the author is saying that when God created by speaking, it was Jesus the Word that was doing the creating. He's identifying Jesus with the Creator God. Now, back in Genesis, the first thing that God created was light. And immediately in John we read, "In him was life, and that life was the light of all men, the light that shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not understood it. Now in Hebrew thought, light meant God's revelation. And so John is saying that through Jesus, we see the Creator. But there's another big reason that the author is linking his account of Jesus with the creation story. And it's this: Jesus marks the start of God's new creation. This comes into sharp focus right at the start of the resurrection account in John, and it's so subtle you can easily miss it. But in John 20 verse 1 we read, "Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance." Now, when John says the first day of the week, he's making a reference to the 7 days of creation. On the first day of creation, God created light. On the day of the resurrection, the light of the world, Jesus Christ, had been raised, but no one had seen him yet, and so it was still dark. Jesus stepped out of the tomb and into the garden and appeared to Mary, who mistook him for the gardener, a reference to Adam in the Garden of Eden. And so John is showing that Jesus is the new Adam. He's the head of a new humanity. And so, very quickly and very subtly, the author references the creation story and uses it to present Jesus as the creator of the old creation, the start of the new creation, and the head of a new humanity. Now, I've highlighted just 6 verses, but this is how the whole New Testament works. It takes the narratives and the themes of the Old Testament story and shows how they point to Jesus, and then applies that to our lives. And so the Old Testament gives the map that makes sense of Jesus and what it means to follow him. So, to finish off, what does all of this mean for us? The church has very often made the mistake of dividing the world on the one hand into the sacred bits, that's kind of church and prayer and Bible and worship and mission and so on. And those are the bits that really matter. And then the other bits are the secular bits, that's work and family and social life and so on. And they can't be avoided, but if God's going to judge the world, they don't really matter, they don't count for anything. This is absolute nonsense, and the only way that we can think like that is if we forget about the creation story. God didn't make the creation so that Jesus could come and save us. Jesus came to save us because God wants to have a creation that reflects him and with whom he can share his love and his creativity and his wonder. Jesus isn't coming to rescue us because nothing else matters to God. Jesus is coming to rescue us because everything else matters to God. Salvation isn't the reason for creation. Creation is the reason for salvation. We're called to follow Jesus, but we're also called to be human. And so everything that is required to live a fully human life matters to God. This is great news. It's not just the religious bits of our life that matter and count. The religious bits are supposed to shape all the other bits because they all count. We're called to be involved in God's plan to reach out to the world, but we're also called to live a full life in God's world, to express his love, his creativity, his goodness in everything that we do. All our life is meant to be lived as worship and as love. All of it is supposed to be redeemed. So that's creation and fall. God's wonderful, ruined world. And that's the frame that makes sense of the rest of the Bible story. In the next session, we'll introduce the story of Israel and God's rescue plan, and then we'll look specifically at the stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob and his sons, the patriarchs.